We are buying you out. 15 cents on the dollar. Take it, or we will dilute you to nothing." The words came from Julian Reynolds, the man who had once called himself my partner, my friend, the person who had shaken my hand in a cramped garage apartment and promised we would build something revolutionary together. Now he sat across a mahogany conference table in an office we had furnished together, flanked by our third partner, Preston Cole, both wearing matching expressions of calculated cruelty. "A charity case," Preston added, leaning back with practiced disdain. "That is what you have always been, Owen. We carried you this far out of loyalty. But this company needs real leadership now, not dead weight." With a sympathy stake, the folder they had slid across the table contained a buyout agreement for $850,000 on my 40% stake in Vanguard Diagnostics, the company I had co-founded, the company built on technology I developed. $850,000 for shares they both knew were worth tens of millions. The conference room felt airless. Outside, the San Francisco skyline stretched toward the bay, the view we had toasted when we had signed the lease on this office. That felt like another lifetime, another version of these people who now stared at me like I was something to be managed and discarded. What they did not know, what their arrogance and their lawyers and their newly inflated egos could not conceive, was that the patent underlying every dollar of Vanguard Diagnostics valuation was not in the company name. It was in mine, solely, legally, irrevocably mine. And they were about to learn exactly what that meant. My name is Owen Vance. And at 42 years old, I had already learned that intelligence and opportunity do not always arrive in the same package. My mother raised 4 kids on a respiratory therapist salary after my father decided family life was not compatible with his other interests. We did not go hungry, but we understood math in a way comfortable people never do. We knew the calculation of whether we could afford both the school field trip fee and new shoes, whether the heat stayed at 64 or 67 degrees, whether the slightly cheaper grocery store was worth the bus fare to get there. Mom never complained. She worked her shifts, helped with homework, and treated every person with the same respect, whether they were surgeons or janitors. She would say that everyone is carrying something heavy, and kindness costs nothing. That shaped how I moved through the world, not with bitterness about what I did not have, but with awareness of what others might be experiencing. That skill turned out to be useful in ways I had not anticipated. I had put myself through university on scholarships, loans, and a rotation of jobs that kept my sleep schedule perpetually chaotic. I graduated with degrees in biomedical engineering and materials science, then landed in a research position at a medical device company developing next-generation prosthetics. The work was fascinating, but the corporate environment was suffocating. Every innovation required 17 approval layers. Every experiment needed justification in triplicate. The gap between what we could do and what we were allowed to try felt like working with handcuffs on. By 34, I had started side projects. Evenings and weekends, I had been exploring adaptive neural interface materials, substances that could respond to electrical impulses from nerve tissue, potentially creating prosthetics with genuine sensory feedback. Not just mechanical replacement limbs, but devices that could feel, that could integrate with the body's actual nervous system. The implications were staggering. The science was years ahead of anything in commercial development, and I was doing it in a one-bedroom apartment with equipment I had built from salvaged components and student-grade materials purchased on a budget that would have made my corporate colleagues laugh. That is where Julian found me. Julian Reynolds had the pedigree I lacked. He had a prestigious business degree, venture capital connections, and family money that provided both investment capital and social access. He had been researching the prosthetics market, looking for emerging technologies worth building a company around, when a mutual acquaintance mentioned my work. He had shown up at my apartment on a Tuesday evening, all calculated casual in expensive jeans and a button-down, looking around my cramped lab setup with an expression I could not quite read. "You are really doing neural interface research here?" he had asked, picking up one of my prototype sensors. "This is graduate-level stuff. Why are you not at a university lab?" "University labs move slow and publish everything," I had replied. I am not ready to publish. I am ready to build something real. That had sparked his interest. Over the next 3 hours, I had walked him through my research, the conductive polymer composites I had developed, the signal processing algorithms that could interpret nerve impulses, and the theoretical framework for creating genuine sensory integration. Julian had listened with an intensity that felt validating. Finally, someone who understood the magnitude of what this could become. This could be worth hundreds of millions, he had said as he was leaving. But you cannot develop it alone. You need infrastructure, funding, regulatory expertise. You need a company. I need to maintain control of my research, I had countered. I have seen what happens when corporations swallow innovations and bury them in development hell. What if you were the corporation? He had asked. Co-founder, significant equity stake, decision-making authority. I bring the business infrastructure and funding connections. You bring the technology that makes it all worth building. The idea had been intoxicating. My research freed from both corporate bureaucracy and my apartment limitations. Real resources, real timeline, real impact. We spent the next month hammering out terms. Julian wanted to bring in Preston Cole, his former college roommate who had been working in medical device sales and understood the commercial side of the healthcare market. The three of us would split the company. Julian and Preston would each hold 30%. I would hold 40% as the technical founder. It seemed fair. I had the core technology. They had the business expertise and industry connections. The lawyers had drawn up partnership agreements, operating contracts, equity structures, and everything formal and proper, notarized and filed. What I had done separately on advice from a law school friend, who had helped me without charging, was file the core patents in my individual name before the partnership formed. The neural interface materials, the signal processing innovations, the integration protocols, all of it protected under patents listing Owen Vance as the sole inventor. Vanguard Diagnostics would license the technology from me. It was an exclusive license with generous terms, built to support the company growth. But it was a license, not ownership. My friend had explained it simply. Your invention, your protection. The company can use it, build on it, make money from it. But if anything happens to the partnership, you keep control of the core intellectual property. At the time, it had felt like paranoid overcaution. Julian and Preston were my partners, my team. We were building something together. I had filed the patents anyway. The first 5 years of Vanguard Diagnostics were exactly as successful as I had envisioned. We had raised seed funding, then a Series A round that brought in $15 million in capital, built out a proper lab, hired a small team of brilliant engineers and researchers, and started clinical trials for our first product, a prosthetic hand with genuine tactile sensation. The test results were extraordinary. Patients could feel texture, temperature, pressure. A woman who had lost her hand in an industrial accident had cried when she felt her daughter face for the first time in 8 years. A veteran could handle eggs without breaking them, feel the weight of his son's baseball glove, and experience handshakes instead of just performing them. The media coverage had been overwhelming. There were profile features in medical journals, and interest from major prosthetics manufacturers who wanted to license our technology. Our valuation had climbed from $50 million to estimates approaching $200 million as we approached federal approval. Julian and Preston were fielding acquisition offers monthly. My 40% stake, on paper, was worth $80 million. I had moved out of my apartment into a modest house, paid off my student loans and my mother mortgage, and started sleeping regular hours for the first time in years. The work remained extraordinary. Every breakthrough felt like science fiction becoming reality. Every clinical success reminded me why this mattered more than money or valuation. But the relationship with Julian and Preston had started shifting. It was small things initially. Conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Strategy meetings I was not included in. Hiring decisions made without my input, even for technical positions. Julian had started introducing me at investor meetings as our technical specialist, rather than co-founder. Preston had begun framing decisions as the business side versus the research side, positioning my input as narrow expertise rather than leadership perspective. When I had raised concerns, Julian had been smoothly dismissive. "You are overthinking it, Owen. Everyone knows you are essential to this company, but investors want to see business leadership, not lab coats." It is just optics. The rationalization had been plausible enough that I had accepted it. I stayed focused on the research, the clinical trials, the actual work that mattered. Meanwhile, they had been planning. The science became impossible to ignore after we closed our Series B funding round, which brought in $50 million at a pre-money valuation of $150 million. My stake was now worth $80 million on paper, and theirs $60 million each. That is when the organizational restructuring began. Julian had brought in a new chief financial officer, a sharp-edged woman named Sienna Croft, who had immediately started optimizing operational efficiency. She introduced new approval workflows that routed through Julian and Preston, modified signature authorities that reduced my financial oversight, and restructured committees that diluted my voting power on key decisions. All of this was presented as professional maturation, the company growing up from a scrappy startup to a serious business. I pushed back on some of it, but the framing was always the same. Standard corporate governance, investor expectations, fiduciary responsibility. Question it too hard, and suddenly I was being defensive, territorial, unable to scale with the company growth. The real warning came from our head of engineering, a brilliant woman named Fiona Caldwell, who had been with us from the early days. She caught me after a team meeting, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Owen, I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise you will not reveal I told you." My stomach dropped. "What is going on?" "Julian and Preston have been meeting with Aegis Biomedical, not about partnership or licensing, but about acquisition. And the terms they are discussing are structured to minimize your payout." Aegis Biomedical was one of the major players who had been circling us for months. They had deep pockets and established distribution, everything needed to scale our technology globally. "How would they minimize my payout?" I asked. "I own 40%, Fiona hesitated. "The structure they are proposing treats the patents as company assets. You would get your equity percentage of the company's sale, but the patent value would be calculated separately and allocated based on some formula Sienna developed. From what I overheard, it would reduce your effective payout by 60 or 70%. "The patents are not company assets," I said slowly. "They are licensed to the company. I own them individually." Her expression shifted to confused relief. "Then you are protected. But Owen, they do not think you know that." I have heard Julian refer to managing expectations and addressing the technical founder problem. Whatever they are planning, it is not friendly. I spent the next week moving carefully. I confirmed with my attorney that the patents were properly filed and the licensing agreements were airtight. I reviewed every company document I could access, looking for angles I had missed. What I found was worse than I had imagined. They had been preparing a dilution strategy, issuing new shares under terms that would have reduced my stake from 40% to roughly 12%. The authorization was buried in corporate governance provisions I had signed years ago, language I had not fully understood at the time. They had also been developing a narrative. I found draft presentations on a shared cloud folder. These were materials for the board positioning me as technically brilliant but strategically limited, unable to scale with leadership demands, and a risk factor for acquisition negotiations. The framing was insidious. It was nothing overtly false, just selective emphasis and careful innuendo. They claimed that Owen was great at research but did not understand commercial realities, that I was attached to the technology in ways that might complicate strategic pivots, and that my equity stake was disproportionate to my current contributions. It was death by 1,000 implications, building a case for pushing me out. The meeting had been scheduled with 24 hours' notice, billed as an urgent strategic discussion with just the 3 founders. I knew before I walked in what was coming. Julian and Preston had been waiting in the conference room, the buyout folder already on the table like a prop in a rehearsed scene. The offer had been insulting. 15 cents on the dollar, framed as generosity. "The company is moving in new directions," Julian had said with practiced sympathy. "Your contributions have been valuable, but the leadership team needs different expertise now. This offer lets you exit with dignity and capital to pursue other interests. $850,000 for an $80 million stake, I said flatly. You are calling that generous? Preston leaned forward, dropping the sympathetic pretense. We are calling it realistic. That $80 million is paper value based on technology you developed on company time, with company resources as part of company operations. The actual value of your contribution, separate from the infrastructure Julian and I built, is significantly lower. A charity case, he had added, using the phrase clearly designed for maximum impact. The character assassination was almost impressive in its efficiency. They wanted to rewrite the entire history of Vanguard Diagnostics, erase my contributions, and reduce years of partnership to patronizing charity. Julian slid the folder closer. Sign today and we can make this clean. Refuse and we move forward with dilution and restructuring. Either way, your role here is ending. The only question is whether you leave with something or nothing. The rage that moved through me was not hot. It was ice cold and perfectly clear. For 7 years, I had trusted these people, building alongside them, believing in a shared purpose and mutual respect. And they had been planning to rob me the moment it became convenient. I pulled out my phone, opened my document folder, and placed it on the table between us. Before I respond to your offer, I said quietly, I want to make sure we are working from accurate information. You mentioned technology developed on company time with company resources. Let us clarify that under federal law. I pulled up the first patent document. This is the core neural interface polymer composition. Patent filed 14 months before Vanguard Diagnostics was incorporated. Sole inventor, Owen Vance. Under Title 35, Section 261 of the United States Code. Patent ownership vests in the inventor. I pulled up the second document. Signal processing algorithms for nerve impulse interpretation. Filed 11 months before incorporation. Sole inventor, Owen Vance III. Integration protocols for sensory feedback systems. Filed 8 months before incorporation. Sole inventor, Owen Vance. I looked up at their faces. Julian had gone pale. Preston was staring at the screen like it was a venomous snake. Every core patent underlying Vanguard Diagnostics technology, I continued, is filed in my individual name. The company holds an exclusive license to use this technology, licensed from me under terms we negotiated when the partnership formed. Terms that include royalty provisions if I am ever forced out, or if the company is sold without my consent. That is not, Julian started, his voice cracking. It must be documented. It is documented, I interrupted. It was filed with the Patent Office and referenced in our original operating agreement that your lawyers drafted and you both signed. The company has exclusive use only as long as I remain an equal partner with appropriate decision-making authority. Termination of that partnership status or any attempt at hostile dilution violates the covenant of good faith and fair dealing, reverting the licensing terms to standard commercial rates. Preston had found his voice, though it was strained. You cannot hold the company hostage like this. Those patents should be company property. You developed them for company purposes. I developed them in my apartment with my equipment before this company existed, I corrected. Then I licensed them to our partnership under favorable terms. Terms you are now violating by attempting to force me out. Before meeting with Wesley, I sat down in the office of my patent attorney, Donald Finch. Donald had represented me for nearly a decade, starting back when my ideas were just equations on a grease-stained whiteboard in my apartment. He reviewed the original licensing agreement, tracing his finger along the provisions that tied the exclusivity of the patents directly to my active employment and equal governance rights. He looked up, a sharp smile cutting across his face, and confirmed that the contract was ironclad. He explained that if Julian and Preston tried to strip me of my title or dilute my share of the company, it would constitute a material breach, rendering the licensing agreement voidable at my option. That meant I could walk out the door and immediately enjoin Vanguard Diagnostics from selling or distributing any products utilizing my neural interface polymers. The leverage was total, and Donald advised me to use it not as a shield, but as a sword to reshape the entire transaction. Julian had been scanning his phone, presumably checking with their legal counsel. His expression confirmed what I already knew. I was right. They were trapped, and the power dynamic had just inverted completely. "What do you want?" Julian asked finally. His arrogance entirely evaporated. "I want my 40% stake respected," I said. "I want equal partnership authority restored. I want Sienna Croft and her dilution schemes gone by the end of the week, and I want both of you to understand that if you ever attempt something like this again, I will revoke the favorable licensing terms and charge Vanguard Diagnostics market rate royalties retroactively from inception. The retroactive royalties would amount to approximately $75 million based on our valuation and standard medical device licensing rates. It would have bankrupted Vanguard Diagnostics and destroyed everything we had built. But it was legally airtight and entirely within my rights. The next 3 weeks were professionally brutal and personally clarifying. Julian and Preston scrambled to contain the damage. Sienna Croft resigned quietly. The dilution plan was shelved, and the acquisition discussions with Aegis Biomedical were put on indefinite hold. But the partnership was irretrievably broken. We could maintain professional civility in meetings, but the trust was gone. Every decision became a negotiation, and every discussion carried undertones of suspicion. Fiona Caldwell was promoted to Chief Technology Officer, a position that should have existed from the beginning. She became my strongest ally in what was now effectively a cold war within our own company. The board, once deferential to Julian business leadership, suddenly remembered that the company's entire value proposition depended on patents I controlled. My opinions carried new weight, and my votes mattered. The narrative about technical expertise versus business leadership vanished once everyone understood the actual power structure. But running a company in a state of internal conflict was unsustainable. The innovation that had been the heartbeat of our startup started suffering. Clinical trials continued, but new research slowed to a crawl. The energy that comes from collaborative excitement was replaced by the exhaustion of constant vigilance. I started exploring options. The patents were mine, the technology was proven, and I did not need Julian or Preston to continue advancing the work. What I needed was a different kind of partnership. I needed people who valued collaboration over control, who understood that equity meant equity, and who would not mistake temporary executive titles for permanent authority. I found what I was looking for at Aegis Biomedical. Their chief executive officer, Wesley Thorne, was a man of excellent reputation and ethical leadership. He had approached me months earlier about potential collaboration, and though I had declined at the time out of loyalty to Vanguard, I now scheduled a private meeting. Wesley met me at a quiet coffee shop in Palo Alto, far from our offices. "I heard there has been some turbulence at Vanguard," he said carefully. "Industry gossip being what it is, my partners attempted to force me out for a fraction of my equity value," I replied. "They did not realize I owned the core patents. We have reached a stalemate, but the partnership is not salvageable." He absorbed that with a thoughtful nod. "What are you looking for, Owen?" "Option 1, I said. I leave Vanguard, revoke their licensing terms, and license the patents to another firm. That bankrupts Vanguard and frees me to work with a company that values genuine partnership." "The nuclear option," Wesley observed. "Effective but destructive," I agreed. "It would hurt our employees who did nothing wrong, delay technology that could help thousands of patients, and waste 7 years of development work. I do not want that if there is an alternative. Option 2 is that Aegis Biomedical acquires Vanguard Diagnostics under terms that force Julian and Preston out, compensates me appropriately for both my equity and patent value, and provides a leadership structure where the technology can continue developing. I join Aegis as Chief Technology Officer with significant equity, and we scale this technology the way it deserves." Wesley was quiet for a long moment, clearly running calculations. "Julian and Preston will fight that acquisition," he said. "They control 60% of the voting shares. They control 60% of shares in a company that has no value without my patents," I corrected. "I can make it clear that any acquisition I do not approve triggers immediate licensing revocation. They can sell the desks and coffee machines, but the actual technology walks out with me." "That is hardball," Wesley said. "That is reality," I replied. "The patents are mine. I was generous in letting Vanguard use them because I believed in the partnership. That belief was misplaced. I am now looking for actual partners who understand that mutual benefit means mutual respect. Wesley extended his hand across the table. Let me talk to my board. If we can structure this right, I think there is a deal that works for everyone who deserves to benefit. The acquisition negotiation took 5 months. Aegis Biomedical made an offer of $220 million for Vanguard Diagnostics, contingent on Owen Vance joining as Chief Technology Officer and transferring the patent licenses to the merged entity under defined terms. During the 5 months of negotiations, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Julian and Preston hired a team of high-priced corporate attorneys, hoping to find a single crack in the licensing agreement or the patent filings. They spent weeks analyzing my corporate emails, trying to argue that some aspects of the polymer chemistry had been developed after Vanguard Diagnostics was incorporated, which would have made it joint intellectual property. But Fiona Caldwell and her engineering team had documented every phase of development with meticulous detail, keeping laboratory notebooks that clearly showed the foundations of the technology were completed during my apartment research phase. When their own lawyers finally admitted that there was no legal path to challenge my ownership, under Title 35, Section 261, the partners were forced to face the reality of their situation. They realized that their choices had narrowed to accepting their $42 million each, or receiving absolutely nothing while the company collapsed into bankruptcy. The structure was elegant. Shareholders would receive their percentage of $140 million. The additional $80 million would be paid directly to me as licensing transfer fees for the patents, separate from the equity payout. My total compensation was $56 million for my equity stake, plus $80 million for the patent transfer, totaling $136 million. Julian and Preston received $42 million each. They argued it was unfair that equity should be equity and that the patents should be company property. The board was unsympathetic. Aegis' offer was the only serious acquisition interest remaining, and no other buyer wanted to risk me walking away. The choice was simple. Accept Aegis terms or watch Vanguard Diagnostics collapse while I took the patents elsewhere. They signed. The transaction closed 8 weeks later. Vanguard Diagnostics became a subsidiary of Aegis Biomedical. I joined their leadership team with both the resources and authority to continue advancing neural interface technology. Fiona Caldwell and the core engineering team came with me. Julian and Preston had their $42 million each, but their professional reputations carried permanent asterisks. The story of their attempted theft followed them, making investors cautious and potential partners skeptical. Some mistakes cost more than money, and some betrayals echo longer than bank balances last. 3 years after the acquisition, the work at Aegis has exceeded all my initial expectations. We received federal approval for our first-generation devices and started clinical trials on neural interface applications beyond prosthetics, including potential treatments for paralysis and chronic pain conditions. The technology my apartment research sparked was finally reaching patients who had been waiting for this breakthrough. Wesley has been the true partner Julian pretended to be: collaborative, respectful, and genuinely interested in advancing technology rather than just exploiting it. My mother retired comfortably in a beautiful home near the coast, and I endowed a scholarship at my alma mater for first-generation college students pursuing degrees in engineering. The money provided long-term security, but more importantly, it provided the complete freedom to focus on work that actually mattered. If there is wisdom to extract from this experience, it is that protection and generosity are not opposites. Filing patents in my own name before forming Vanguard was not distrust. It was due diligence. Licensing them under favorable terms was generosity. Maintaining leverage if that generosity was abused was wisdom. The defense is documentation, clear agreements, and understanding where actual power resides, not to wield it cruelly, but to ensure fairness remains mutual.